great opportunity to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to Ben and Dan for organizing this conference at the Schweitzer Institute. Maybe before we start, a little bit of background. I actually come from political philosophy, analytical political philosophy, and I've written my PhD on institutions for future generations or institutions for future people and how we should reform democracy. And I've tried to translate some of that into how we may be able to include or consider non-human animals in democratic processes. So yeah, political philosophy may come through at times. I may also turn a bit more pragmatic. I'm also part-time consultant, and that's the other side of things at the moment. So what will we do? First of all, I'll try to give an overview of the different kinds of arguments that have been made for the inclusion of non-human animals in democratic processes. There are roughly two different ways to do that, and I will go more into detail later, but there's a procedural way to argue for the inclusion of future of animals and non-human animals, and there's also instrumental path to justification of such institutions. I will highlight some challenges for these kinds of arguments, and we'll show how we may be able to deal with those arguments and challenges. And I will also try to provide some insight into how we actually already, at least to some extent, consider animals, non-human animals in politics, and how we could go beyond that. This is the agenda. The argument basically of this has 5 steps. First, we conceptualize the inclusion of non-human animals. Second, I will make an argument how we should include them. What I would call an ideal argument, or the ideal setup for inclusion, how that could look like. Then I will talk about how we look at this at the moment, and then I would talk briefly about further steps. Just a bit of history. It's less than 170 years ago that slavery was banned in the US, and then we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended, officially at least, racial segregation. It is a little more than 50 years ago only that Swiss women were allowed to vote. And since 2014, we have always had at least 2 members of the European Parliament who were in animalist parties. So one from the Netherlands and one from Germany in all those elections. We also have, and I would come to that later, in many municipal entities, representatives of animal parties already, but there are also many other ways that animals to some extent are at least considered or represented. So what we can observe here is a kind of general trend, what has been called the circle of inclusion, and that at least to some extent widens. Right? That does not mean that we're already at the end of this process. I hope we are not, but it has at least a certain direction, I would argue. Okay, now to the more theoretical part of my argument. When we think about democratic inclusion, we usually make a claim of the following sort. Everyone who is affected by the decision of a government should have the right to participate in that government. That's one version of the so-called all-affected principle. There are many different versions. I will talk about that in a second. But what you can notice here, there's a kind of relationship claim. So those affected are part of a community. And because of that, they have what I would call a procedural entitlement, some kind of way to be involved in that decision process. Let's go into a bit more depth regarding these 2 concepts. So first, the relationship claim. There have been many different kinds of arguments how you should be related to to a community, so that you should also be part of that community in political terms. It could just be that you are citizens. It could be that you're legally subjected. It could be that you are coercively affected by a law or by a certain decision, or it could just be that you are affected in a causal way. And for all these claims of relationship, different people have argued that this is the right way to think about it when you think about the political community. That this is the defining criterion to demarcate who should be included and who should not be included. Normally, of course, these arguments are only about human people, but obviously, for all these, you could also argue that non-human animals also could be part of this community if you think about it more closely. But later to this. Then, secondly, we have the procedural entitlement. And this can also come in various forms. You can obviously have something like direct democracy, where people are part of a deliberative process, and then there's a referendum at the end. You could have representation. You can have accountability mechanisms, consultative mechanisms, transparency, public justification, or some kind of consideration. And these are various types in descending order of procedural entitlements that we would owe to all those who are part of the political community that we're discussing at the moment. The third step then is to make an argument for democratic inclusion. So from, okay, everyone is affected, we owe all those who are affected the specific procedural entitlement. I'll give you one example of this, which is from my previous work on future people, and I'll read it out. It's from Christian Skagen-Ekeli, a Finnish academic. In a number of cases, future generations are among those parties or the parties who are significantly affected by present democratic decisions. This seems to imply that at least democratic decisions that significantly bear upon the lives of posterity cannot be regarded as legitimate unless future people have been given a voice in the decision-making process. I would like to highlight a few points regarding this quote that I just mentioned. So, when we think about these arguments, we can think about the object of that argument. It's the lives of posterity that are relevantly affected. They are affected in a specific way, significantly. So that's magnitude, or I would call that magnitude. They are, in this case, affected through a democratic decision. That's the mode of being affected. And lastly, we have the procedural entitlement that follows from that, in this case, being given a voice, whatever that means in this case. Actually, just to specify, that actually makes an argument later on that we should in some way represent future people in our democratic. Just to give you a hint of that. So we must in some way then connect the relationship claim with the procedural entitlement. There are many different ways we could do that. And I would say that we should look at three different things here. First is inclusiveness. We say that all the that are affected are part of the relationship claim, not just some. So, and then you can go into detail again, how do you demarcate that? Then you have some kind of proportionality that you should think about. So we should normally say that then the procedural entitlement, all those who have those procedural entitlements should have the same degree of that, normally, in democratic processes. And when we don't see that, then it's usually a sign that something is not fully democratic. And the third is equality. Treat similar things or similar decisions, similar kinds of being affected in the same way. Now let's step to the argument for the representation of animals. This could look something like this. Non-human animals are affected by democratic decisions made today, which is the relationship claim. Given this, non-human animals are entitled to representation in the political decisions made. That's the procedural entitlement. As a result, non-human animals ought to be represented in democratic decision processes. And now we could later go into detail what representation means, but before that, I would like to go into different arguments that follow roughly this logical structure and go into a bit more detail what they look like and what challenges arise when we think about that. First two arguments are by Dobson and Eckersley, Andrew Dobson and Robin Eckersley. First, the argument by Andrew Dobson. He says, if environmental policy affects transboundary populations and future generations, it also affects other species. One right granted to humans is the right to democracy, enshrined in the Article 21 of the 1947 UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is not perhaps as far-fetched to claim a similar right on behalf of at least some species of animals. From a 1998 article. What he later goes on to suggest is something that he calls proxy representatives, where members of what he calls the sustainability lobby are granted some seats in parliaments, and these are only elected again also by the sustainability lobby, and they therefore also forgo their right to vote for other people in parliament. So they have to vote for the sustainability lobby representatives, but cannot go for the other vote in order to not give them two votes instead of one that and not treat everyone else unequally. Similar kind of arguments to some extent we find in Eckersley's work. All those potentially affected by ecological risks should have some meaningful opportunity to participate or otherwise be represented in the making of the policies or decisions which generate such risks, from her 2011 book. So she does not go for representation in the sense of having individual representatives, but instead opts for a kind of environmental office, which would then defend the rights of ecosystems and groups of animals. Then we have a more ambitious argument that has been made by Cochrane more recently. Alistair Cochrane in Sentientist Politics suggests to use some form of the all affected principle also to determine the relationship claim. He argues that all sentient animals are affected have a procedural entitlement, and he defines that as being represented. And he suggests that in order to choose those representatives, we should set up some kind of mini publics, so where people are randomly brought together and then decide on who should be the representative of animals in parliament. And if I understand him correctly, what he says is for each constituency, we should have one representative for humans and one for non-human animals. So we basically have a parliament with half of the representatives representing non-human animals there. We have one further argument that I would like to present to you before I come to the challenges. And this is the work by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker in their book Zoopolis. And there they argue for a more differentiated view on what it takes in order to be part of the relationship claim. And they have three different kinds of categories to define or to determine what kind of status you have within the community. So for what they call domesticated animals, they grant them citizenship status, which are full members of the community, and they have to be treated just like that. So they don't differentiate it anymore for this group between the human and the non-human animals, as far as I can understand the argument. Then we have wild animals. So those what they would say outside of the community. They are not really affected by our decisions, and therefore they only have sovereignty, and we may have duties of assistance. So similar kind of arguments as you would have in international political theory sometimes, but not more than that. Then you would have something like liminal animals, animals that live close or within our, you may call a human society, but who are not directly influenced or who have not gone through domestication in the same way as domesticated animals. And therefore they have something that they call denizen status. So they have the right to secure residency and fair terms of reciprocity. So an example that they give is rats. They live among us, but we haven't domesticated them, and therefore we have some kind of moral obligations towards them and political obligations towards them, but more limited than towards, for example, cows, which we have domesticated, or dogs. And I've put 2 quotes here, which I would like to read out to give a bit more flesh towards the argument. We can elicit a range of expressions of preference to construct scripts of domesticated animals' interests, and can bring those into the political process to help determine ongoing fair terms of interaction. Domesticated animals, we argue, should be seen as co-citizens in this sense, with the right to be represented through forms of dependent agency in our political decision-making. And what they suggest on how we could actually do this, how we could represent them, is through kind of collaborator system. And there's a second quote which explains this a little. Domesticated animals have the capacity to participate in the process of democratic participation if assisted by those collaborators who have learned how to interpret their expressions or preferences. So this is a very ambitious project where you would actually have people who know specific individual animals, and these people would feed in those interests of those individual animals into the political participative process, as far as I understand the argument. And I would like to move to one example that they cite. So they both live together with some dog companions, and they give one example of such a process where collaborators and animals took care of a specific deliberative process, you could call it in some way, maybe. So there's a public park in Canada where they live, and it had become a hangout for drug users and prostitutes, abandoned by families and other, intimidated by the presence of illegal activity. Then it was taken back by an informal group of dog owners who invested in improvements in security and used the presence of large off-leash dogs, which is illegal there, to discourage less desirable uses. Paradoxically, just as the park became more attractive, the other local residents signaled their desire to use the park but objected to off-leash dogs, framing the issue as dogs versus kids. Dog owners prevailed in part by normalizing dogs as legitimate members of the American family and urban community. Like other urban dog parks, this park is now a distinctive place for both people and animals, and remains a locus for grassroots participation in the governance of urban park and recreation facilities. One small instance of what this could look like. So having given you kind of overview of different kinds of arguments that can be made for the inclusion of non-human animals, I would like to turn to some challenges which you probably already have raised in your minds regarding the inclusion of non-human animals. So first, why not only humans? Why to open the relationship claim at all towards non-human animals? So let's think about a moment for the kinds of arguments that could be made. The most common argument that is made is I guess, rationality. So in order to deliberate, in order to participate fully in a political process, you need some capacity to deliberate and to build your own opinion. And this is beyond, at least that's the argument, what non-human animals can do. But if you actually think that through, you come to the point, you must come to the conclusion that also some humans lack this capacity. And if you really would follow this path, you would need to disinclude some humans from the political community. What you could do instead is, and I think which is more intuitive, is we actually think about our institutions as more inclusive because we include these people nonetheless. We include children, we include disabled people, or those in some way not able to fully participate politically. We do that nonetheless. Why should we not do this also with non-human animals? Right? So I think you can turn this argument around. Rationality as such seems not be a good demarcator unless you want to go fully down the road, which also means you really have to think more carefully about what that means also for including all humans, which would not be possible. There's a second argument or a second problem. Where do you draw the line? I think John also pointed towards the problem that when you think about sentience, it's not really clear where the demarcation line is. And most arguments that I've presented use this kind of criteria. So Martha Nussbaum uses this in her work, Donaldson Kimlicka uses this criteria, and Cochrane also suggests sentience as the demarcation point or the criterion for demarcation. What I would, or how they all define this roughly is sentience is the capacity for subjective experience. And I actually like the phrase that Donaldson and Kimlicka use. You can ask yourself whether the being opposite you, whether there's someone at home, whether you can think of this being as having individual feelings and a kind, of being that it perceives of itself also. Okay, so sentience is what is suggested. What this also means is there are probably beings that are not sentient, or at least we can discuss this, right? And for those, we have to think about whether they are included or not included. We may still think that they're included on other terms, but not on this basis, right? So what we could say is that, for example, they get a different kind of status, not full political rights, but some other set of procedural entitlement. But that's something, to think about at another time. I would like to focus at least here on those that we clearly can consider part of the political community as because of their sentience. There's, however, a third problem here: legitimate representation. When we think of representation, that normally is a process which is qualified by some kind of input legitimacy. You have to elect in some way. Then there's secondly some kind of responsiveness normally between the person elected and the person represented. And thirdly, there's also accountability afterwards. You can or cannot re-elect that person. And there may also be other kinds of accountability mechanisms. With animals, non-human animals, that's really problematic because they cannot vote in the normal sense. And this is what Eckersley points to here. Basically arguing, okay, we cannot use all the normal kinds of legitimacy mechanisms that we would apply. The only thing that we can actually, which we can actually point to is that we care for those beings and as such may be able to represent them. So authorization, accountability, and presence, that's all really complicated when you think about legitimacy of representation. what can you do in such cases? And Robin Eckersley argues, okay, what we can have is some kind of experts. Some people know animals really well. Bit close to what Kim Lickler and Stu Donaldson also argue, where they talk about collaborators. So some people know animals well, and those could speak for those animals. Yeah, those who care and those who know. That could be two criteria that could be employed here, and these would confer at least some legitimacy as normal mechanisms of legitimacy are not available. Now we come to the fourth problem, which I think is the hardest problem, but in fact also the argument that I think is most interesting. Normally we think of political standing and numbers in the following way. We think that all humans are entitled to equal representation. So one person, one vote. But if you think that carefully through, once you include all non-human animals that are sentient, they are the majority. Right? I first came across this when I was thinking about future generations, which is a huge majority also. But it's the same thing actually with non-human animals. Once you start thinking about it, they are actually the majority, actually mostly domesticated animals. If you think about sentient beings, well, depending on where you draw the line, but when you think about mainly mammals as sentient, then yeah, it's domesticated animals who would hold the majority. And a lot of people would actually argue, including Andrew Dobson, that this would be absurd, right? The conclusion would be that human beings would be in the minority position, but would have to represent the majority of non-human animals. And this would really raise the complexity of politics to a level which is probably not feasible.